Hello and welcome to everybody watching. My name is Dan Auerbach. I am an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Wyoming. I am here with Peter Fine, who is this year's nominee to the National Endowment for Humanities Summer Stipend Competition. Each year, the Wyoming Humanities Research Institute, on behalf of the University of Wyoming, nominates candidates for the NEH competition. Winning one of these grants allows a researcher dedicated time during the summer to focus on their projects. I'm really excited to be here with you today, Peter, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Why don't you just give us a little introduction?
My name is Peter Fine, as Dan said, and I teach in the Department of Visual Arts, and I teach what we normally just generally call graphic design, but the degree is in visual communication design. So that's taught within an art department, and I'm an author and a writer on the subject of design, more of a critic than an historian, because that's not my training. And I've written a couple books about design. I'm working on a third one, and it's all about design documentaries. So it's about the way that design is featured and seen, documented, how it's received by the public, and then who are the people. It's most of these documentaries are about persons and their personalities and who they were in terms of the history of design, the recent history. And so it all starts with Helvetica. The name of the book is The New Design Documentary, and I'm starting it off with Helvetica in 2007 as this turning point where prior to this, there really weren't decent films about design of any kind, documentary or otherwise. Maybe a couple of dusty films about the Bauhaus and really just about architecture and the kind of the great figures of that, but pretty vague. And then there was this turning point, and there started to be a lot of attention around design more generally. And this was part of that. So it wasn't just that, you had access to the tools that you've had since about the mid 80s of design, for graphic design especially, but you had access to social media and to the internet, and people could just find out things and learn things about design and do design themselves. And I think, I assume, and I think that, and that's what I want to look more into, is created a more general interest for films describing who these people were. And even in the time that this has occurred, which is relatively recently, like a lot of these people were from the 20th century. So they have passed away, or they're starting to pass away. So there's a sense of obsolescence in terms of them and in terms of the stuff that they produced. And my question for the book was like, well, where does this fit for the design student? That was where I started with this, presenting these films, and then seeing like, okay, is this the history of design? Is it a history? Is this the canon of design? Are we going to make films about all of the great designers, and that becomes the canon? And then what is the archive then? It expands that archive.
Right.
And my main question is like, when in examining this, I'm looking at the documentary itself as the design artifact, rather than like saying, going, further in through the camera and looking, well, there's that typeface, or there's that toaster, or whatever it is, or there's that building. Not looking at that artifact, but looking at the whole life of the people described in there and the major themes.
Interesting. So. Yeah, very interesting. So you can talk a little bit about Helvetica, kind of what drew you to that, and kind of how that led to something.
Well, it was the novelty, right? That there wasn't anybody talking about these things. When I went to school, the first time I heard the word font was in the classroom. It's not like now where there's an SNL parody about papyrus, right? Like, because people didn't have access to the means of reproduction, right? Mechanical reproduction and then digital reproduction. They didn't talk about these things. So that was the first time I learned that. There was an insiderness to it. It was much more cliquish. It's still cliquish. It still has its own vocabulary. It still has its own ways of thinking about the world and how to design for that world, and just thinking about the small details. But now that's available to so many more people. And so it was the novelty, and then to present it to a student body, it was so novel to be able to have such a well-produced film. And that's also the other thing I want to look in, is like, look at these things as objects of design unto themselves. So looking and seeing like, okay, the production values are so high, it's similar to the kind of production values that the kind of people who are designers would bring to that subject.
Right.
And so that became really interesting. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Interesting. And so then how many films total are you taking a look at?
I had to
within
count last night. It was 28.
28.
Yeah.
So what's kind of the process that you went by? I mean, it seems like you mentioned 2007.
Yeah.
So it's not that long of a period of time.
Right.
But 28 films about design within that time period seems pretty
And they're
extensive.
coming from different aspects
Yeah.
or different disciplines within design. So my training is in graphic design. That was my main interest in teaching a design history course. But I always taught it in a broader sense, like not just the graphic design, but all the other types of design that interact with that, industrial design especially, architecture to a certain degree. So they're on different disciplines that are outside of my normal disciplinary, purview, but it's all part of the same history in terms of like when this is all mostly since roughly the second industrial revolution, right? So once we had trains and telegraph and all that stuff and, beyond steam, where there was just the wide distribution methods and systems of design so that people could receive all these goods.
Right.
Right. So I don't remember your original question. Oh, how do I just find
that and what's the common thread, right? It's a wide variety of films, and you mentioned different types of designs, both within your wheelhouse and kind of stretching beyond that. So what's the thing that connects these together?
Well, they're almost always about a person or persons.
Yeah.
Right. When they're not, Helvetica is a little different in that the attention is on a very small part of life that most people didn't notice, right? And the story of how it became a typeface, probably a pretty boring subject, right? But then it becomes available through the PC and the Mac, and then everybody starts to use it. And as they describe in the film, it becomes like air. So things that we don't normally notice, even though everything around us is designed, except for, I don't know, pine cones and acorns. I don't know. You can tell me. And it's not, again, my thing. But so this accumulation of just like all those little things in life that make up our lives and how we live through designed objects. But most of the films are about a person or persons.
Right.
Helvetica is about several people. And then like the second chapter which is finished, which is about two different films. One is about the Vignellis, people who would be largely unknown unless you'd studied graphic design. And then some more popularly known people, the Eames, Charles and Ray Eames, right? And they're two kind of power couples in design. So that's about two couples, but it's also about the gendered politics of designing in the 20th century and how that was seen and not seen, and how it really affects the way we think about design. There's certain things, certain aspects of design are considered the feminine, and some aspects of design are considered the masculine. Whether they actually exist in these very binary ways is not at all true. Most people who are successful, which these films are usually about successful people, they've managed to balance, let's say, so the intuitive side of design would be considered the feminine or feminized side of design, whereas the so-called rational or scientific or empirical or universal, these words we use to describe a lot of modernism, those would be considered the more masculine qualities of design. But nobody has succeeded as a designer at any kind of level of visibility without being able to balance those things. So it's that chapter is a lot about those tensions. So a lot of the book is about a feminist critique of design. So
I noticed that in kind of your write-up, and it seems like for me, how you conceptualize this project is the tensions and contradictions that exist between the universality or the presentation of the universal, but really the racialized and gendered particularities of that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those tensions and how they're kind of present throughout a lot of these films and design in general.
They're present in the relationships between the people. So in those cases, those were romantic couples, right? Who were married and very successful designers and partners, right? That's a very unique position. And then they also, they enjoyed and took part in a domestic environment within the professional environment at the same time, right? So their studio would very often be where a lot of their domestic life was played out. They were also visible in the public. And so their life was visible to the public. They were on a stage, right? A kind of stage set where very often there weren't very many female designers. And a lot of these films, the book is about the male whiteness of these films. The argument someone would make is, well, that's who most of these prominent people were, right? But there is an exclusionary aspect to it. And So there's that. There's like how things happen and work and come to be in a studio setting.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's just labor. It's a lot about labor history, like who did the work,
Mm-hmm.
whether they were recognized,
Mm-hmm.
whether their work was then appropriated by someone else, often a man,
Mm-hmm.
or an institution that has a very male quality to it, right? That also occurred. And then there's some working class origins to this stuff, and also like blue collar, and also low level, just clerical work, right? Like there's a film, Graphic Means, this one here, which is more or less about the time when I came into design, where you were doing a combination of analog and digital, right? You had the digital with the help of the Mac, right? And then all the Adobe products and PostScript printing. So that means the production came into people's hands. But since you see like a woman pictured here on the cover, operating what I think is a Verityper, which is an old typesetting machine. I have to look for sure. But the introduction of women into the workplace, where had been the printing trades, right, which were largely male, blue collar, unionized, right?
Mm-hmm.
So women came in through new technologies that were associated with clerical work, and therefore not with creative independence and creative agency. And really the thought was like, just like with the typewriter, and Ellen Lupton talks about this in case the viewer wants to know, is that the connection between technology, machines, and women had to do with their movement into positions of clerical positions, where they took over machines that were thought not to need, a lot of intellectual or creative capacity. So I'm probably droning on, but
no.
This is also like an important moment, because these are largely anonymous people, more anonymous when they're female, doing work that isn't necessarily the work that's going to be winning the awards to be in the Museum of Modern Art and stuff. Like some of these documentaries are about people whose work helps establish our ideas about what good design is, and whether it is going to end up under glass, like in a museum setting, the way a piece of fine art would. So the working kind of labor aspect of it is really important too. Like who did the work,
right?
And how were they paid, and how was that coming into? How was that technology? And then also like a female body being pictured here, heels, legs, dress,
right.
That all is part of the stereotypical aspects of how this stuff becomes gendered. And stuff
right.
like that, so.
And then there's probably a fascinating history about the relationship between productive labor and reproductive labor, right? That's associated with this. And we've created this false analytical divide between them, but productive labor does not occur without reproductive labor. Right. And so I'd imagine there's probably a fascinating, even more hidden history of women in design, but they found non-masculine outlets to do this type of work, which actually provided the foundations.
Right. And the history of that is there's a lot of, most of the critics that I have read over the year, the critics, mostly historians, are mostly from the UK, mostly looking at establishing that feminist critique of design, did start often, being trained as historians of architecture, but then they decided to look in the attic and look in the basement. And then they started looking at craft and the relationship of craft. And they found out that there wasn't really a difference, and there was differences in terms of whether these applied arts were considered as high a level as fine arts, right? But in terms of the type of training, often there was overlap, someone might be trained as an architect or maybe trained in the academic arts, but then go into something that was considered more feminized. So both uncovering that, but also uncovering, how cottage industries moved into industrial production and how that was carried forth, and that happened over a fairly quick period of time, and how quickly reproductive technologies of mechanical reproduction came and then went and dissipated. And now some of these we honor, if you look at, this is a linotype, the film about the linotype machine. Right now, it's an archaic method of producing literally a line of metal type, right? That now is considered, this is something that they find these old machines, they get them going again, they start working with them again. This is happening with letterpress as well for quite a while. And that came out of the 1960s, when people started looking at things that were considered more craft-based within an art context, and then bringing those back into the classroom. But again, these kind of technologies now that have gone away, people, as they revive them, they take on a different aura. kind of related to our ideas about nature and about, especially like the pastoral idea of America, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea about like, this is actually very difficult labor. The machines like actually spewed hot metal. Mm-hmm. The rooms were noisy, crowded. Mm-hmm. Again, if women came into that space, they would come in low numbers. And then, they had to make their way through that very masculine sphere of the print industry. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't necessarily like the way we see it now is kind of with rose-colored glasses, that these are a more, quote, natural way of designing or making work, right, away from the PC or the Mac and stuff. So
I think what I find really fascinating about your work is like you take something that seems so far removed from social and cultural relations, right? Mm-hmm. Design is just it's something that's a font on your screen that you select from a pull down menu.
Right.
But what you're really doing is you're uncovering, no, this is a part of gender, race, labor history, and is very much shaped and influenced by these things. Yeah. And so it seems like, I was wondering if you could talk about, because some of your previous work is on that intersection of critical race studies, sustainability, and gender within the context of international design practice. So I was wondering if you could tell a little bit more about how your previous work informs this work.
The race issue is definitely a big part of it because of my study and interest in whiteness. Actually, through Wire, I've met some really important scholars of whiteness here, like I think in this building. George Lipsis was one of them. David Roediger. I also met through events that Wire organized, and the two of the main people scholars of whiteness. And so it really definitely overlaps with aspects of male whiteness and how that defines and establishes what design is, who gets to design, what designs get accepted and used, and so forth. So actually in the book I did called The Design of Race, the first thing I interrogate is the film Helvetica, and Massimo Vignelli, who's an emigre designer from Italy, he's recently deceased. He was this really important figure in modernism in graphic design, which is itself even a more narrowly defined aspect of design. It's part of the Swiss style or the international style. They call it an architecture. And he created many of the logos that American Airlines is one he looks at closely on camera. But he begins he's the first person interviewed in that film, and he begins it with some very racialized statements. And I'm not saying that they're racist statements. I'm saying they're racialized. And and he's not really acknowledging the long history of this, And so that's one of the places I really begin the introduction of the book, talking about the assumptions. And I think they really are ideological assumptions. And because he's fairly dogmatic in the film, and you're not really sure whether this is just kind of his shtick. This is the way that he presents himself, as a figure of eminence and of authoritative expertise, right? And how much of this he's really aware of and he's thinking about critically. And I don't know all the answers to that. And what's great about some of these documentaries is that, I don't know if this is true of other fields, but designers that happen to be very bad about actually describing what they really do, right? So if they have more time on film to discuss things, you might generally over time get a basic idea. But so that a lot of that was based in my experience with those films and presenting those. And, I'd have students go, that was really great what he said. I'm like, well, that's also problematic. Like he was saying that the role of design is to cure visual disease, right? This is, and these statements about what design does and its relationship to like all kinds of things, for instance, hygiene, right? And hygiene being related to racialized ideas.
Yes.
He wasn't thinking about this critically. I'm not sure, so.
Well, a lot of like ableist language kind of gets embedded within that.
Right.
So,
And so, that's where one of the places that book began. But that book actually began with my MFA thesis. And then, so that was a very long-term project that just slowly, over time developed. And then I decided I would do that book. And I thought that book would be a much later. But that's the one I really felt like, okay, well, I've really arrived in terms of my own authorship. Like there's being a writer and there's being an author. And since it was my second one, that really had a big impact on the way I was thinking about, well, what will my next project be? And the previous book was on sustainability. And that actually has a lot of overlaps with race and space, especially. I go more into that in the new book because I'm looking at architecture, the built environment. There's a great film on Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, the famous public housing complex. And then, so all these things still kind of overlap where I'm still thinking about some critical issues. Mostly it's a feminist critique coming out of authors and scholars from the 80s, mostly women from Great Britain, but they've been largely ignored. We're not really, we're not talking about them really even in this moment where ideas about the gendering of things is very prominent and visible in a way that's much more visible than when I began. I mean, when I was trying to do my thesis in 2001 to 2004, my MFA thesis, there wasn't much I could read about what designers were saying about race and representation and gender. And I was really split between doing one of either focusing on the gendering of design or the racialized aspects of design. So, and a lot of this is part of my teaching. It affects how my point of view, the designer's point of view is what makes them the designer. Right. It's their way of looking at the world. And that's a very consistent thing in the history of design. Like anyone who's ever been prominent or recorded and ends up in that history, in that canon, that art, and their work is in an archive somewhere, is because they had a specific point of view and they stuck with it. Right. And they were often exceptional or extraordinary people. Regardless of that, they're still working with these large systems, that are allowing them to be the person that they're going to be in that moment. Right. And those things really have to come together. There's a film here about Dieter Rams, like he featured prominently in Helvetica, or rather Objectified, which is another film. Same director, I should say. Gary Huswit did Helvetica, Rams Urbanized, but then I think he liked this character so much as this German designer. He designed most of the products for Braun in Germany in the post-war period. But what's really interesting I was looking at the documentary about him. Again, there's almost no mention of the split between East and West. Right. West Germany during the period, which was one of the defining aspects of what was happening in that moment, and how the students that he went to school with and that he ended up working with, many of them had either the teachers had come out of the Bauhaus in the pre-war period and interwar period. And there's almost no discussion of the moment. There's a lot of discussion about him as a person and a character in a story about really good design. Yeah. And then what happens to it once it becomes so commodified that another corporation like Gillette wants to buy it and make it into that brand into a commodity in and of itself. Even though that's actually what's happening as the wall is coming down. Right. Everything is changing and everything's going to change. And, the West is going to eat the East and, but that's not really discussed. So interesting. That's a complete blind spot. Fascinating. And those blind spots are very interesting. Right. So, yeah. It kind of seems like that's kind of where you try to situate yourself within that, talking about early on in your thesis work, there wasn't much of that intersectionality type of analysis. At least intersections of race and gender and things like that. Yeah. So I'm curious how you see your work now situated within the broader humanities. So you'd mentioned before, there wasn't much, you didn't have much to draw from. What's the context now in which you see your work and how does it contribute? Right. Well, I mean, the original impetus was to make a contribution to the field. As an undergrad in graphic design, you're thinking, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to study design, it's fun, it's enjoyable, I want to work in that field, and you do that. And then if you want to do further work, in terms of academia, which is not at all a requirement in the field, then I was like, okay, what do I want that contribution to be? And then it ended up being related to race and representation and design and how representation actually works. For the humanities, I think it's the films as cultural artifacts, because what I'm trying to do is marry design studies with film studies. So design studies is a much broader view of design than, say, just design histories, which are more discrete. You're looking at one aspect of this. It's like taking an object or an experience or some sort of artifact and what are all the different actors that give it meaning. So the designer would be one of them, but then how does someone's work, let's say the Eames chair, right? Now it's so iconic that it's taken on a different meaning and anybody can adopt and accrue that meaning unto themselves, assimilate unto themselves and become part of them. Right. So it's really in terms of the humanities that the films themselves as cultural artifacts, understanding them from a film studies as well as a design studies perspective, and what do they mean to the general public? Like, how will the general public through them then receive design in a way that they couldn't have previously?
Right.
Like these films didn't exist, and then the level of production is so high. Many of them are very well made that they also kind of take on that aura of the designer and the aura of design itself, and therefore become an object of design. So, yeah.
Interesting. You had this interesting kind of term phrase earlier, and I kind of want to get back to it. You said viewing the distinction between a writer and an author. Kind of curious a little bit about how you separate those two, and
one is just the everyday work of the writing,
so the labor of it versus,
that's kind of like you're just kind of laboring, you're doing the writing. And like I'm talking about myself in this case in the third person for some reason, but I'm like for a long time just doing the writing, and then I was like, oh, okay. Then it was published. I'm like, oh, okay. There's a different point of view to be the author, and it was similar to the way I was taught to understand design, right? So just take on a different positionality and just decide, oh, okay, I can position myself as an author looking at this stuff and a critic, right? Rather than as just a designer, right? Because I've kind of moved a little bit beyond that. Like I didn't anticipate that, when I was working, like say in a design studio, that I would eventually just write about design for the most part and teach design. There's not enough time to do everything. And this takes a lot of time. So, so I think it's just about about the labor, like there's the work of it. And then there's the positionality and thinking about yourself as someone who has a lot of agency over what you're going to decide and do, which is really what I want my students to leave school with, which is enough agency that they could carry themselves forward for at least several years beyond basically the burnout phase of any job.
Right.
Which it ends up meaning, it just ends up being a job. So like, again, with the writing, there's the job of writing, but then you need a little something more, to carry you through and over like the next hump. And I think that understanding your position, in my case, understanding my own position and then giving it the regard I need to give it so I can, oh, that's right, that's what I'm doing.
So I always like Jose Saramago, what he says about writing. He says writing is hell, having written is divine. Right? This type of thing. But, curious, with this notion of being an author, right? There's different considerations, because as the writer, the labor, you're doing the work, but with the author, there are the other considerations, right? How do people, how do you think other people will perceive this type of work, right? So I'm kind of curious, thinking about as you work on a project like this, what do you hope that like artists and designers get out of your research?
I do teach, I've always taught in an art context, so in an art department. So for the artists, there's so much for them to look at in the world around them. So let's say they're working on an MFA or something, or a BFA. There's so much of their world to consider, and so much of it is going to come from objects, experiences of design. And if not, then it's some sort of probably media experience, So drawing on some of their, some aesthetic influences or just things around them, understanding what design is would be really important, because then they could really speak critically about, and I mean make work, right, critically, which I'm very much in favor of. And then deciding, how they're going to narrow their focus and develop ideas. For the designer, it just would be for them to be able to figure out better how to place themselves in a history. Like when I teach, I'm thinking about I'm teaching, undergraduates largely who want to be designers. So how do they place themselves in history and understand their position, right? So this is more to help them understand, what are they really doing and for whom? There's a lot of, there's always going to be some self-interest. And the thing about being a designer is that you're hoping that you'll get enough self-expression out of working for other people's interests, right? That could be a client, right? We usually think about it in the commercial zone, right? Like there's going to be a client, there's going to be a product, right? But it could be something where the person has no access to they can't even say if they're homeless and they don't even have a job. They can't trade their labor for income and then use that to buy designed objects. Like, where do they fit in, right?
Right.
So you don't have to have a client, but thinking about who are they doing? If they're doing it for someone else, are they going to get enough of their own creative expression? Because you really don't go into these things if you don't want to have some degree of creative agency and expression
Right.
in your daily life.
Right.
A lot of these films are about people who have managed to somehow transcend labor and do things that they love doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
This, in modern times, I would say like recent contemporary times, like the last 20 years, this has become incredibly important to individuals across, especially American culture and Western culture.
So why don't you pick up a little bit on kind of getting the artist to think about their creativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where we left off.
You mean talking about like their actual labor and their work?
Well, that and yeah, I mean, just kind of, yeah.
Well, I mean, for like the designer, like helping them understand what it is they actually do,
Mm-hmm.
or at least complicate it to a degree where they can think more about it and maybe what it is they would more prefer to do more of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at these people, even if they're in these documentaries, even if they're very well known designers, they're still largely anonymous. The only person that there's been one made of that I think is pretty well known is Milton Glaser, who did the I Heart New York. And then he did the Dylan poster, but he did a lot of other things. And so, there's, even if you're very well known in, say, graphic design, it's still a largely anonymous position. But I mean, that's also interesting and fun. I used to really like it because I would do something behind the scenes and someone else would see it and they had no idea how it got made. Now people have a more clear idea of like how something gets made, but it doesn't mean that like even a very well-known person like Charles Eames, like he's kind of reduced to a chair, right?
Right.
And then it's really Charles and Ray Eames, the couple, and then it's reduced to just Charles and then just to the chair. So helping them to understand like, well, what does a designer do? And do they like doing it? Like, and what we were talking about, I think maybe off camera, was like some of the people in most of the people in these documentaries seem to transcend just ordinary labor. They end up doing something they really love. Yeah. That love and labor get mixed up. It also gets mixed up in terms of like some of these couples in these films where there's a domestic space in that workspace, right? So there's, even when the more clear it becomes, sometimes the less clear it becomes.
Yeah.
But,
interesting.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. Just kind of one last question, thinking about books as something that are out there in the public and you really have no control over. What do you hope a general reader gets from this? What do you want them to leave?
Well, I mean, there's so many, like one of the themes, like for the last, like at least 30 years has been that people in society, especially American society, Western society, want to have more creative jobs, period. And then as we had things like social media start to really ascend, you saw much more and more of that impulse being realized, so people can now realize their ideas. They can even formulate and realize their ideas in real time through social media, right? And so they can in a way design the kind of life they want to have. So I remember reading, I think it's Richard Florida's The Rise of the Creative Class. I mean, it's got to be 35 years old. And when he actually interviewed people about what kind of job they want, people said they would much rather be a hairstylist than, work in an office job, because then at least they'd have like some kind of creative job. Well, that is actually happening more and more, right? And you don't actually need to necessarily be educated or have the expertise, but you can learn it through the media itself as you're making it. So I think helping people maybe will help people to understand like the history of how that has occurred before, and maybe they can have more control over those outcomes, and maybe, I mean, more often than not, historically, people that have started off as amateurs and then achieved success as professionals, right? Understanding how that happens could be really important for somebody.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah, absolutely. That there is a pathway to it. And that it's primarily through.
But I think it's just this general trend of people being more interested in design. So sometimes we might refer to that as fashion or style or something as fashion or style, but that's a way to trivialize it or make it seem, perhaps a vain enterprise, just related to like and dislike and so forth.
Right.
But if we say design, then we know already we're being more serious about our intent, right? Because design is always about intentionality.
Right.
I intended to do this thing and make it and have it affect this thing, right? So it's usually aspirational, right? In the best sense of the word. And it's usually positive, and that you're trying to make some kind of positive change almost always.
Right.
So.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this turns out.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.